Natlan's Archon Quests are over, and I have to admit that I'm disappointed. This whole region has been a roller coaster for me. Even before 5.0 dropped, I had gone from excited by our first glimpse of the saurians, to underwhelmed by the character reveal trailer, then to even more excited after the livestream blew me away. And while I have my complaints about some aspects of the story leading up to the finale, especially the Interlude quest, for me, the first 4 acts as a whole did a pretty good job at delivering on the promise of the new region. The world quests were fantastic, and I loved the ambient quests. I was so excited for the finale. It felt like it was poised to be one of the best Archon quests so far. Instead, Act 5 left me feeling even more frustrated than Meropide. How did it all go so wrong? Before we get into this, it's worth noting that perspectives on stories are always varied. My favorite parts of the story will be some other people's least favorites, and things I couldn't stand will be the aspects which made others love it. That's a good thing, and I love hearing different perspectives. As long as it doesn't devolve into a flame war, a good discussion about what led to people's divergent feelings can be fascinating. So please, bear that in mind when you get to the parts where you inevitably disagree with me. I'm not saying your perspective is wrong, so don't at me. And of course, this video will contain spoilers for each act of the Archon Quest as part of each section, though I'm going to keep it very high level. Natlan's trailers left me feeling unconvinced, but the livestream completely changed my mind, and by the time 5.0 came around, I was so ready to dive in, and I was not disappointed. Acts 1 and 2 were centered around the annual pilgrimage, which the warriors of Natlan take part in. The pilgrimage is a tournament, and the winners gain the honor of traveling to the different dimension called Night Kingdom to fight back the Abyss in defense of their nation. I found this part of the story pretty entertaining overall, very much helped by the fact that I liked Kachina a lot, since the whole story focused on her. She has a satisfying character arc. She starts off racked with self-doubt, unsure why she has been chosen to bear an ancient name, and abandoned by her teammates. Morlani steps in to help her out, and eventually, Kachina wins her place in the pilgrimage via grit and determination. The tournament arc was a fun experience. The pacing was pretty great for the most part, the cutscenes were amazing, and when Kachina ends up stranded in the Night Kingdom, surrounded by enemies with no way to escape, I was fully on board with the mission to rescue her. My only real complaints at this point were that, as usual, the denouement was far too long. Much of the world building didn't really hold up to scrutiny, though it was interesting enough that I kinda gave it a pass. And it was also a little odd that Capitano just gave up on getting the Gnosis after a single fight. One detail which stuck out to me was that it felt refreshing that Mavuika was more approachable right from the start, and openly shared her plans with the Traveler and Paimon. At this point, it makes a lot of sense for their reputation to precede them and open doors like this, and it felt like a nice subtle way to show that they're now seen as an important figure in the world. Act 3 started off with the Traveler and Shilonen working together, trying to forge an ancient name so that the Traveler can be revived by the Ode of Resurrection if they die in the Night Kingdom, making it safe for them to join Mavuika on her quest to destroy the Abyss once and for all. They rope in the help of Citlali, who sends them off on a further side quest to clear Auroron's name, and even though I liked Auroron and always have time for Capitano, going on a side quest to a side quest to a side quest just didn't hit the spot for me. After all that, there was another side quest, this time involving Chaska and Koichi, and my main memory of that section was an intrusive thought that Koichi was definitely going to die at some point before we leave Natlan. While this act felt bland in comparison to Act 1 and 2, and I didn't really find any of it particularly engaging, I couldn't help but keep comparing it to Fontaine's Act 3, which was such a pain to grind through that Natlan's filler act felt perfectly adequate in comparison. Act 4 began with a side quest which I legitimately remembered as the climax of Act 3 instead, until I went back and fact-checked this video. We infiltrate a cave system, and after some shenanigans involving Auroron being possessed by a vengeful spirit, we prevent Capitano from carrying out his own plan to save Natlan from the Abyss. He wanted to destroy and reconstruct the ley lines, which would have solved the Abyss problem for now, at the cost of wiping the memory and personality of every person in all of Natlan. This felt like the seeds of a really interesting story to me. Capitano and Mavuika have the same goal, but they disagree on how to achieve that goal. Capitano's plan is reliable but has a steep cost, while Mavuika's is risky and uncertain but would not involve such sacrifice. Exactly the kind of core conflict which can make for a compelling story. He seems to take it with a shrug, however, and is oddly friendly with the other characters once his original plan is thwarted. And then the Abyss invades Natlan. The remainder of Act 4 was brilliant. I loved so much about it. They really tried to make this feel different, impactful, and for once, our actions had some consequences which made them feel important. The whole war sequence felt so exciting. I felt genuine pressure to make quick decisions and rush towards objectives in the hopes of saving people. For once, I was the one pushing forwards, rather than some characters saying, "We need to rush," while they all just stand around and talk. I particularly liked how with every choice you made, you saved some people and you lost some others. For me, me, this emphasized that in war, nobody wins, and no matter what you do, people suffer. It's interesting looking back at it. Objectively, there's little difference in how the gameplay worked compared to previous stories. Each section was a simple fight and then some chatting to NPCs afterwards, but something about the way it was framed just made it work so well for me. I know some people who just did not get into it at all, but for once, I found myself gripped even by the conversations with random NPCs and felt emotional about their plight. Even more impactful was the horrible moment when I thought Toto had died, which almost brought me to tears, only to find out that she was injured but would be okay, which really did make me cry from pure relief. I can understand why this whole act would fall flat for people who didn't really get into it, but for me it was brilliant. The cutscenes especially were absolutely epic and felt like a true climax. Unlike certain other cutscenes from earlier in the game, it felt like a real battle instead of a handful of people play acting. Koichi's death felt impactful despite me seeing it coming a mile away, and that scene of the aftermath with the list of names of people who died was touching too. Even though they were NPCs you knew nothing about, it felt like it had meaning. The only thing which spoiled that feeling a little was the fact that all of Natlan was back to normal straight away. Given that there would be an interlude quest before the finale, I would have hoped for some lasting effects which we could maybe clean up before the final act, but sadly, this was not to be. Overall, to me, Act 4 felt like the climax of the story. If that had been the end of the Natlan arc, then for the most part, I'd have been very happy. Several key plot threads are left dangling, but they could have been tied up without an extra act, and this would have been an incredible climax. Next, the interlude. Thankfully, this was pretty short because while I love the intent, the execution was awful. This part of the story aims to show the aftermath of the war, as Ian-san and the Traveler tried to help several people struggling with something akin to horrifically acute PTSD. But this representation of mental illness and healing is so bad that I struggle to express how far from reality it is. If we could solve mental illness in 5 minutes by constructing one specific scenario which snaps the victim out of it, then the world would be a much more wonderful place. But sadly, that is just not it. While I thought this quest was absolutely awful, the patch brought Natlan with its fantastic world quest which sucked me in and felt very engaging. So despite my disappointment in the interlude itself, I ended up still anticipating what the final act of the Archon Quest would bring. And then came the finale. Act 5 kicked off with an ominous dream, which could have been the perfect way to start building up the tension. Instead, the next hour of this quest was pure filler. The Traveler and the Natlan cast set up a party together and then stand around chatting. It was probably supposed to create a sense of community and show that they all have vibrant lives with real friendships, something notably lacking in the earlier Natlan quests, but it just did not work for me when introduced this late on into the story. I usually enjoy the parts of the story where the characters kick back and relax together, but unfortunately, the timing and sheer length of this section killed it for me. I went in expecting something more like Act 4, with tension from the start building up to an epic climax, but instead, there was just so much empty dialogue. I was not enjoying myself. The next section lasted almost another hour and again just did not work for me. After a little walk around Natlan with Kachina, during which we give human medicine to a baby saurian like that's totally something which would work and is not concerning at all, the Traveler finds Xilonen and Citlali and they make their way into the wilderness to test whether the Traveler's new ancient name has properly connected to their soul. After Citlali very rudely pushes Paimon aside, the ancient name passes the test. But the process attracts many lost souls, and Citlali and Xilonen do the exact thing I hate so much, which Hoyo had avoided so brilliantly in Act 4. They spend literally 20 minutes wasting time with inane conversations about how this is unexpected, and they need to rush in order to save these souls, but woe is me, they cannot save all of them, only the ones who are more recent. Absolutely anything to stop them from actually doing the thing they're talking about, and it absolutely drove me up the wall. Even the part with the baby saurian's grandparents fell completely flat for me, with its complete lack of urgency and the ever-present aversion to subtext. This could have been a really touching moment, built on some interesting world building and great character moments, but instead, I was just so frustrated. By this point, I was, unfortunately, really not enjoying the quest, so all of its flaws just stuck out to me horribly. The kinds of details which I can usually just shrug off and push into the background were a lot harder to ignore. The awkwardly small crowds in the overlarge arena, the painfully slow sections where the Traveler strolls past the adoring people, the lack of compelling dialogue. I was glad that this section was at least much shorter. Once we get into the Night Kingdom itself, we have a couple of fights, playing as Mavuika, before she runs across her long-lost sister, and the two of them are oddly cheerful. Again, there's no sense of urgency from Mavuika, but even weirder was that neither of them seemed all that affected at finally talking to one another after 500 years apart. Maybe there's some explanation for this in her story quest, but this was utterly bizarre to me. We then swap over to the Traveler, who fights some more Abyss enemies and is this time joined by the spirits of characters from previous quests in the region. I like this callback to some of the memorable NPCs from Natlan, and I'm glad to see them tie the world quest into the main story. Despite that nice touch, and the section which follows, where the heroes of old step forth to see us on our way while the Sealies come to light our path, unfortunately even this felt like it was trying to be dramatic, but just didn't land for me. I can imagine it felt amazing to people who were invested in the story at this point, but for people who aren't, it just falls apart. That was followed by probably my favourite section of Act 5. As we get closer to our destination, we in 12 different types of saurian, weaving our way past obstructions, zipping through a hail of meteors, and then sailing the Spirit Way while being bombarded by the enemy. This was engaging, varied, and felt like an actual action scene with proper tension and challenge. The cinematography here was particularly good, proof that Genshin can get it right when it really matters. The cutscene which followed was beautifully animated and must have been utterly hype for people who were into it, but after feeling like everything so far was such a slog, it just lacked enough spark to get me invested in the end. The battle against Gasoithoth was a little bit awkward too. Just before the fight, the Traveler resonates with Pyro for the first time, but I sure as heck am not going to take a moment to read through a character's kit before continuing. As a result, my attention ended up split 3 ways during the first half of that fight. All at once, I was trying to get the hang of what is effectively a brand new character, figure out the mechanics of a brand new boss fight, and pay attention to the dialogue from several characters which was happening all at the same time. And then, just when I was getting the hang of it, it cuts to Mavuika, who walks very slowly up her rainbow roads once again. There are few things I hate more than sections of a story which could have been fine as a cutscene, but instead you just have to press a button to make your character slowly walk forward. It's bad enough even at the best of time, but in the middle of a climactic battle? Just why? After a leisurely stroll, we get another cutscene, again beautifully animated, but this one was even more of a miss for me. Natlan's flame goes out and the crowd watching the stadium all come together to sing their support, which brings it back to life again. To me, this felt really disconnected from the action. There was zero question that the Traveler and Mavuika were at risk of failing at this point, so why would the flame go out? Either way, the Traveler hears their voices, and the pair of them draw Mavuika's flaming sword and go back to battle. The next section of the fight had the same issue as the first one, this time trying to figure out how to combine Pyro, Traveler and Mavuika in battle while understanding more boss mechanics, while trying to keep track of the dialogue at the same time. It just felt a bit disorienting. We then hear the words our friends said about us, and wield the Sword of Friendship 3 times to smite the dragon from the sky. 2 people wielding one sword in a dramatic pose over and over felt rather goofy to me. This was another point where I can see what they were trying to do and why it must have felt amazing to some people, but it just didn't work for me at all. The lack of any moment of fear, any time where it felt like we were at risk of failing, and any payoff to all the time spent forging an ancient name so that the Traveler could be resurrected if things went wrong, kept me feeling disconnected from the story even at its climax, and then it was over so quickly. After one final cutscene showing them defeating the dragon, Mavuika's motorbike appears out of nowhere. Note that it has not previously shown up on screen in the quests, and they ride back to Natlan together. Special mention to my other favourite moment of this whole act, Paimon and Traveler getting in a really good hug. The next section was a celebration of the Traveler's victory, which felt like it was never going to end. It makes sense that the people of Natlan would want to celebrate with their new hero, but it felt so drawn out. This is one of the times that I really think would have been better served by the thing they sometimes do, where they display a sequence of photos, showing snapshots of things that happened, and then summarize what went on. It was weird that nobody noticed Mavuika's absence though. The selfies and the autographs were a bit much, and the dance part in particular was just incredibly awkward. But this section was at least partially redeemed for me by all the baby saurians. I really hope that all this made some people feel loved and appreciated, but for many of us who don't really view the Traveler as a self-insert, it sadly just does not work. And before the story can finally be over, there's one last thread to tie off. Zitlali finally notices that Mavuika's missing, and they realize that she has gone to talk to the Ruler of Death to pay the final price for her original deal. She intends to sacrifice herself to restore the Night Kingdom to its original state. They track her down to Natlan, which now has a red sky with the creepy red eyes of Renova watching from above, and they try to persuade her that it has to be another way, that she should not sacrifice herself, and that she deserves a place in the future that she built with her people. As their not so brief debate draws to a close, Capitano shows up, and it turns out that he wants to take take Mavuika's place, and that this was what he wanted all along. And of course, nobody objects to this at all, so he just dies. The animation for Capitano's final moment is, as always, utterly gorgeous, but I couldn't help but feel even more frustrated. Here was yet more proof that Hoyo can tell a succinct and moving story with impeccable timing. They just don't put the effort into it 99% of the time. Cue even more talking about this, during which we're told that he hasn't slept for 500 years and has lived a life of never-ending torture, kinda like Furina in some ways, except that none of this was shown on screen and none of it shows up in his characterization up to this point. After that, all that was left was some more speeches and then a street entertainer telling children the story we just played through just to make sure we didn't miss anything. I've seen a bunch of discussions online where anyone who disliked the final act was dismissed as someone who was critical of Natlan from the start, or a hater who was determined to dislike it without even giving it a chance. I'm sure some people fall into that. But personally, I enjoyed the early acts of Natlan Archon Quest, which may be part of why the final one just flopped so badly for me. I have serious problems with its pacing, feel that it dove headfirst into many of the traps I detailed in my recent video covering the flaws of Genshin storytelling, and feel that its plot has some serious issues. But even outside of those more technical complaints, I feel like this story was just not for me. They set up some interesting concepts early on: a compelling antagonist who shares the same goals as the protagonist but cannot agree to the same methods, a group of heroes from different tribes working together to save their nation from destruction, an overconfident leader who may be reckless in pursuit of her goals, but none of the parts which hooked me in came to fruition. Capitano was sidelined for the majority of the climax and then came in as a deus ex machina with an ultimately unsatisfying conclusion in the end, which threw away all of his vast potential for interesting stories in an eye blink. The heroes never felt like a cohesive unit and few of them got any depth of characterization. There's little chemistry between them aside from a few pairings like Molani and Kachina. There's no intertribal conflict or rivalry to spice things up, and in the end their presence was reduced to some awkward platitudes spoken to build up the traveler's legend. Mavuika turned out to just have everything figured out. Every action she takes has the best possible outcome, she makes no mistakes, and she just has no need for growth or change. And don't get me started on how much I dislike the ethos, which states that lack of fear equates to courage and encourages people to see death in battle as the ultimate goal in life. There's so much to unpack here which could have been explored in Natlan, and it's sad that they just treated this idea as unquestioned gospel. In the end, I'm glad that the finale did work for many people. If you're one of those people and you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my experience with it, even if you disagree. I hear that for many fans of shonen story tropes, it felt like a great example of the climax of one of their favorite story archetypes. For me, it fell short even on that, plus I just can't get excited about a climax without the build-up. But if it works for some, then at least there's some positive to come out of it. Either way, the sharp turn in the storytelling in this final act has, unfortunately, left me feeling much unease about the future of Genshin's story. For me, Natlan fell well short of the very high bar set in Fontaine and Sumeru thanks to my dislike for the ending, and while it was still streets ahead of the other three nations, if Act 5 points towards a new direction in the narrative, then I'm afraid my enjoyment of it may end up failing completely. And that's nothing to say about my general feelings about some of the character designs that feel wildly out of place, as well as the seeming shift in target audience. But more of that in another video. Let's just hope they're cooking up something special for Snezhnaya. Until next time!